Hi, this is going to be a video which I've quickly uploaded it after my last video because I thought this was probably a little more interesting. So I provided a link to the previous video on the left right hand side, and I've also provided a link with inside the video. You see that little speech mark down the bottom, B up, B round there, on my left right hand side. So it'll be the same side which the video description is on. Anyway, I was watching a PBS article which talks about rising religious tensions within inside Egypt, and I thought it was particularly interesting when I was talking about communities, extremism, and identity. I've got a number of points I wrote down here, and I thought it was actually quite interesting, especially in the light of who are the major allies within inside the Middle East. Now, right now, you have was it called America saber rattling over the issue of Iran. Now, I'm not trying to play down the fact that Iran is a potential threat to world peace and world security, given that the people who run the country are these religious nutcases. When I'm talking about religious nutcases, it's important to actually realise that these people believe in a concept called Amendi. I don't know how to pronounce it, but basically, it's the equivalent of those people who, within inside the Christian religious right within inside America, who believe in the end times, the Christ and the Antichrist, and a big global war between good and evil, and Armageddon, and all that kind of crap. It's the same sort of apocalyptic vision. When you're dealing with those kinds of people, quite frankly, they don't give a shit about life. They don't believe that any of this is real, therefore, quite frankly, they just go and do whatever the hell they want because they have no respect for life whatsoever, because they don't believe that life has any value. Which is quite funny when you see the dichotomy, when you have those kinds of people somehow believing that life is sacred on one hand, and yet on the other hand, they somehow just don't give a shit. But I digress. The interesting part is when you look at the type of countries within inside the Middle East who America is friendly with, especially when you consider in the wake of 9/11, and you've got the London city bombings, and you've also got the Madrid bombings as well. Madrid? Is that right? Madrid bomb? I'm going to make sure I don't. Yeah, it was Madrid bombings. Just wanted to make sure I got the right city. And what I find interesting is the fact that there are two countries that are the main propagators of radical Islam. And what I mean by radical Islam, I'm not talking about localized, I'm talking about worldwide radical Islam, and that would be Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. Pakistan and Saudi Arabia are in each other's pockets. At the end of the day, these were the two countries who were the first people who not only financially, militarily funded the Mujahideen, the Taliban. They were the first countries to recognise the Taliban when they took over Pakistan, or when they took over, well, will be Pakistan in the future when they take over it, but when they took over Afghanistan. These people, these countries have a vested interest in propagating their radical, hardcore ideology around the world. The Saudi Arabia ideology being exported into Pakistan is a recent phenomenon, but it is still a matter that it exists in there as it is, through the various means in which the propaganda can be exported, such as funding religious madrasas, such as things that are done in the nature of humanity, which are nothing more than propaganda under the guise of humanitarian missions. You've got books, you've got media, you've got all sorts of resources that are exported to Pakistan. An attempt by Saudi Arabia to expand its influence well beyond its own country. In other words, what you have is you have an otherwise secular idea, empire building, and using Islam as a tool, as a means, as a vehicle in which to justify their claim as being the natural ruler, quote unquote, to the Muslim world. Using this ontological reasoning that Muhammad was born in Saudi Arabia around that area, therefore the Saudi Arabians are the natural leaders, therefore the Saudi Arabian culture, the Arabism, in other words, that exported around the world as the gold standard Islam, out beyond the Gulf region to, for example, Egypt and so forth and so on, like a cascading effect. And what you effectively do is you invade a country by proxy. This is one part where the Saudi Arabians are smart. They know that if you want to recreate something, you want to invade a country, you don't need to have an army. All you have to do is spread your ideology, indoctrinate, and they simply become part of Saudi Arabia by proxy, without a shot being fired. Billions of dollars spent on propaganda, and eventually brainwash a whole group of people to think just like the people in your own country, effectively making them Saudi Arabians. What I thought was the interesting part was the fact that this Wahhabist doctrine is then protected by the United States. You notice that after 9/11, the United States said nothing about the source of this terrorism. The source of this terrorism was not Iran, was not Iraq, it was Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia was ground zero as far as ideological support for such movements, and not only ideological but also financial support through its various different organisations and charities and so forth, and non-governmental organisations. Through this protection of this Wahhabist ideology, here's some interesting numbers which I need to note. There are 17 channels, 17 channels running 24 hours a day, funded by Saudi Arabia, pushing Wahhabist doctrine. Just sit back and think about it for a second. Because of America's pussy-whipped position, the inability to stand up to Saudi Arabia funds to the tune of 17 channels Wahhabist doctrine into Egypt. And out of that, those who were born in the 1950s have noticed a growing number of women who are wearing niqabs, wearing headscarves, things that were unimaginable when they were growing up, having been born in the 1950s. They suddenly saw this upsurge about 30 years ago. What happened 30 years ago? Around 30, 40 years ago, oil was found. America's influence started to get in there. You end up having the gruesome twosome getting together, the House of Saud and the Wahhabis. So what you end up having is a toxic mixture of the three. You end up having America having vested interest in Saudi Arabia, the Saudi royal family have vested interest maintain power through gearing up an alliance with the Wahhabis. The Wahhabis therefore want to ensure that their little brand of Islam spreads, so then they get money, portion of the money from oil revenue, and so you end up having the toxic trio exporting their crap beyond Saudi Arabia. So you end up, unfortunately, having this brand of Wahhabism being exported out of Saudi Arabia as the gold standard of Islam. This belief that if you follow the Saudi version of Islam by virtue of Muhammad being born in the era and yada yada yada, as I noted before, that somehow you are following the genuine Islam, where it's nothing more than a Saudiism, Arabism being wrapped up in the garb of Islam, and otherwise secular political moves being wrapped up in the ideology of Islam to give it more legitimacy than it actually deserves. So what I find interesting is that when you actually look at a lot of the things that are happening around the world, just closing up, I suggest you have a look at when you trace back the sources of these ideologies, the sources of these conflicts, you actually find that Saudi Arabia has their tentacles, has their fingers in the pie. You find that these events aren't just simply a reaction because of Muslims. It is the result of Saudi influence, Saudi brainwashing of the masses to a Wahhabist doctrine, which ends up propagating itself out into intolerance. Intolerance that up until recently was not a common thing. For example, Coptic Christians and Muslims in Egypt were not at each other's throats up until Saudi involvement.